Το τζάκετ το πήρε. Είχα το τζάκετ.
Το τζάκετ.
So, good evening, everyone. My name is Charles Stafford. I'm one of the academic vice presidents here at the LSE. First of all, I just want to thank you all for joining us tonight for what looks like another fantastic LSE event. We have a wonderful speaker addressing a crucially important topic. However, before Kostas's lecture, I just want to say a few very brief words on behalf of the school about the Hellenic Observatory. So as most of you will know, the observatory has a really very distinguished track record at the LSE, for example, in convening events such as this one tonight, in producing excellent research, in nurturing new academic talent, very important thing, also generating significant real-world impact via policy relevant exchanges and interventions. So lots and lots of very important contributions. In light of these contributions, I'm very pleased to report that the LSE has recently awarded full research centre status to the Hellenic Observatory, which will now be known as the Hellenic Observatory Centre for Research on Contemporary Greece and Cyprus. Now, Research Centre organization, that's just a status within the school. But what it means in practice, in case you're wondering why it's important, it means that the Hellenic Observatory is more centrally a part of the school's core research function. And it also means that we're really scaling up our ambitions for what the Hellenic Observatory can and will achieve. So we're expecting a lot more. That's the basic thing that I want to point out to tonight. And I want to add that we're really pleased and very proud and very excited to be launching this wonderful new center tonight. And congratulations to all who've been involved in this. Thank you. So now I've done the ritual bit. I'm going to hand over to the inaugural director of the Hellenic Observatory as a research center, Vassilis Monastiriotis, who's professor of political economy, and he is the Eleftherios Venizelos Chair of Contemporary Greek Studies, and he will introduce tonight's speaker. Vassilis, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Charles. Thank you for the introduction and for trying to pronounce all these Greek names. I was just yesterday giving an interview and the journalist kept referring to me as Monastiriotis. So you did very well with that. Okay, so let me say also a few words from my side. Dear esteemed guests, ambassador, dear students, friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's really a great pleasure. We always say that for opening lectures, but it's also a real sense of pride and responsibility. You heard Professor Stafford talking about expectations. A sense of responsibility that drives us in this new start. And with this sense of pride and responsibility, I welcome you all in this inaugural launch event of the new Center for Research on Contemporary Greece and Cyprus. As the Eleftherios Venizelos Chair on Contemporary Greek Studies at the LSE, but also having at my back over a quarter of a century of research on the Greek economy, the establishment of this new center, building in the history of the Hellenic Observatory, is not only a great honor, but it's also very significant and a great challenge. The observatory has done a lot over its 20-year life, and we proudly say that we are perhaps the most significant research institution on Greece and Cyprus outside the two countries. And as the new director of the center, I have the responsibility of advancing this center to perhaps new heights in line with what is expected from a research center at the London School of Economics. So I want to address this question: why? What does the Center of Greece and Cyprus do in the London School of Economics? So I think one way to answer this is that because LSE has very strong ties with Greece and the Hellenic community historically, there's thousands of Greeks and Cypriots who have studied here, among them some very distinguished people, a few prime ministers, office holders in government, in central banks, but also business leaders. And I have to say, including some people who have been very, very generously supporting us for a great number of years with the philanthropic donations, supporting not only our internal activities, but also the expansion of our activities, reaching out to different audiences, nurturing talent, as Professor Stafford said, and so forth. And of course, the LSE, the other connections that it has been home to some distinguished academics. I want to mention two names: the sociologist Nikos Mouzelis from many years ago, and more recently, currently, the Nobel laureate in economics, Sir Christopher Psaridis. And I take this opportunity also to congratulate the Cypriots in the audience for the award of the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. Just today, I think it was announced to their compatriot, Dr. Demis Hassabis. So congratulations to that. Okay, but the real reason why LSE has a center on research, for research on Greece and Cyprus, because I would argue Greece and Cyprus have this special character, if you want, that is very significant to what LSE tries to do, which is to understand and know the causes of things. Is it the difficult reform blockages? Is it the whole topic of Greek exceptionalism? Is it the issue of frozen conflicts, if you want, and by communal relations, more in relation to Cyprus? Is it how a small economy can destabilize one of the biggest economic blocs on the planet? Is it how it acts as a gatekeeper for Syrian refugee flows, and so forth? Wherever you look, there's something about Greece, or something about Cyprus that concerns the rest of the world, or at least the West. As an economist, I would say this is a typical case of a natural experiment laboratory. Whatever you want to study, Greece is the thing to study. And this is how we fit, I think, at LSE. The new center will go beyond that inward-looking study of Greece and Cyprus. We do want to explain Greece and Cyprus, but we want to move beyond that and to inform, based on our research on Greece and Cyprus, inform the wider debates in the social sciences literature about key issues. And we want to try to do this by ticking three boxes. One is to be always aware of the societal challenges. We're talking about green transition. We have to talk also about just transition, for example, equitable growth, and so forth. We have to be able to relate to policy problems and questions. We cannot just stay in our academic cells and produce the research that we like. We have to relate. And of course, above all, being at LSE, we have to pursue academic excellence with rigorous research, theoretically ground research, and so forth. So as we proceed in doing that, we're going to advance some priority themes. We're going to set, if you want, some agenda in specific areas. And through our research, our collective research, we aim to bring our qualified evidence base into policy debates in Greece, Cyprus, and beyond. I want to highlight two of these themes because they constitute flagship new topics for the observatory, beyond our politics and economics or labor research. The first one is the study of the role of women in society, politics, and economy in Greece and Cyprus, as well as comparatively. We call it our gender theme. And the other one, which relates in today's lecture, is a body of work that we plan to do on industrial policy, growth strategy, and the transition to carbon neutrality, net zero. So we call this our growth and green transition theme. And the lecture today really reflects this widening of our thematic coverage and, if you want, our more extrovert framing. Under the challenge of climate change, the whole planet is faced the question, how do we achieve growth which is not only economically sustainable, but also environmentally sustainable and socially fair. In this spirit, we are tremendously excited to be hosting today a lecture on the theme of clean growth, and very much so by one of the most distinguished Greek economists of his generation, Professor Costas Arkolakis, who's delivering this lecture. Costas Arkolakis is Professor of Economics at Yale University. He's also, very appropriately, I should say, the chair of the Hellenic Studies program at Yale, so a sister, not sister, but a very dear institution on the other side of the pond. He has a number of affiliations. He's research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research in the US. He's a member of the Yale Economic Growth Centre, editor of the Journal of International Economics. I should also say, quite importantly, he's been a recipient of the Borosaki Foundation Prize in Social Sciences for Distinguished Young Greek Scientists. His research is very well published in the top journals in economics, American Economic Review, Journal of Political Economy, QJE, Review of Economic Studies, and many others. But also closer to home, his research has contributed directly to policy informing policy in Greece through his work in what used to be the Greek Economists for Reform group, and more recently, I think, in the Vassilis Commission. Now, before I invite Professor Arkolakis to deliver the inaugural lecture, let me make some housekeeping announcements. The event is being recorded, and there will be a podcast available in some future date, but it's also broadcasted live through Zoom, and on that point, let me welcome also our audience online from across the world. Those of you who use the X or the Twitter, the hashtag of the event is #LSE Greece, I think. We will have the opportunity to have a discussion, questions after Professor Arkolakis delivers his lecture. And for those brave enough in the audience, we'll have a wine reception, I think, afterwards, so stay until then. Across the audience, there's a number of people who are associates and affiliates and members of the center, so do feel free, not during the lecture, but immediately after, to talk to the person next to you in case you want to ask questions about the new center. So we're really very, very happy on behalf of the whole of the team to be hosting this inaugural lecture. We've been saying we're a center for a long time, and from tomorrow morning we can say that we are officially open for business as a center. Please join me now in welcoming to the podium Professor Costas Arkolakis.
Thank you very much, Vassilis and Charles, for the wonderful introduction. And I'm really excited about the center. And, you know, I feel hope about something better will come of the economy of Greece. It's excellent. Okay. Do I have a microphone I can carry, or it's enough to? I guess you can hear me from here.
One of the rotating mics for the speaker.
Is this? Can you hear me? If you can hear me like that?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
No, get this one.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. Okay. Okay, so this is a very wonderful event, and so I'm gonna the clicker. Turn it on? No, it's on. Oh, now it works. Okay. The clicker doesn't work. Okay, I'll just use the mouse. The clicker doesn't work. The clicker doesn't work. If you can fix the clicker at some point. No. The mouse works. Okay, I'll try with the mouse. Okay. Oh, now it works?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, I don't know. So yeah, this is a wonderful event, and I'm going to discuss the joint work with Contemporary Greece, but I'm going to start with bad news. Sorry. Okay, so there has been a vivid debate until the end of the previous century whether the temperature in the globe has been rising. But very recently it became apparent that not only the temperature has risen significantly, but it will keep rising at an increasing pace. Right now we are at 1.4 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial levels. And not only that, but 150 days, more than 150 days out of the 365 days last year, we were above the 1.5 threshold that the Paris Agreement has set as kind of an upper bound for the temperature increases. So we're already kind of heading a dangerous territory in terms of climate change and the anthropogenic effects of climate change. But at the same time, there's some very positive news coming from the renewable energy front. Last year, this is this annual capacity of power generation added to the globe. Last year, the amount of photovoltaic capacity added was almost as much as was added until 2020. So it's like a tremendous growth, even more than we expected, much more than we expected. And we expect that it will keep on. So that comes together with increased generation of electricity coming from clean renewable resources, starting from virtually zero around 2000s for photovoltaic and close to zero for wind, all the way to become like a predominant source of electricity for many of the countries and soon for many others. Now, this is not, while many people just realized very recently, this has been a technological revolution decades in the making. So what I have here is the capital cost of investment in renewables over the years for photovoltaics. So what you see here is that the cost of the first commercial photovoltaic application in 1956, this was meant for satellites that were kind of were sent to space from NASA, has dropped from 1956 to today more than 50 times. So it's more than 50-fold drop, and it keeps on dropping. Soon will be more than 100-fold. And the news are from China that the target that we are aiming for 2030, about 20 cents per watt, is going to be reached even sooner than 2030. So this is really remarkable technological growth. And it has been evident, because people see installation of photovoltaics, installation of renewables, of wind. At the same time, though, there were a silent revolution that was on storage technologies, which in the 50-fold, not so 50-fold, more than 50-fold. The 50-fold is for the battery, sorry. So we have the price per kilowatt hour for storage technologies has dropped more than a 50-fold. Again, we expect that the storage technologies would pair very nicely with the renewables, as I will explain later, will keep on improving and the cost will keep on dropping for many years to come. So what I'm going to talk today is I'm going to talk about this renewable energy revolution and the opportunities and the challenge that it brings. The research I will talk today about talks about a lot about these opportunities that arise. And I want to classify three major ones. The first is economic gains from this great technological revolution. Given that this one of the few revolutions of our times, what will be the economic implications that we will have? And I'm going to make this much more concrete. The second, that I will not talk today, but I would like people to have it in mind for the future, is that it gives the promise for the first time in our lifetimes of European and more energy security. Everyone remembers throughout their lifetime that every day what you care is the oil price and the oil crisis and so on. If renewables completely replace oil and completely replace fossil fuels, we won't have to care anymore about where, all the kind of global conflicts in terms of energy security. So I think it's going to be very big for Europe coming the decades to come. And the other is that at the top, on top of that, it's environmentally friendly. So you can have your cake and eat it too, like people say in Britain, I guess. But at the same time, there are challenges. So the first major challenge is transmission grid constraints. We're going to talk about it a lot, and this is something that Europe cares a lot as well. The second is the intermittency of renewables. That's why you need storage to kind of pair with to alleviate intermittency concern. And finally, the last thing I want to talk about is the local opposition and policy barriers. That's something that we need to think carefully. It's not yet in the news, but it will come. I expect that we will see more and more as renewables deploy, and we need to do something about it, and I want to discuss a bit more. So the way that the presentation will be structured is I will first talk about the opportunities using the research that we have with Conor Waltz, and then towards the end of the presentation, I'm going to talk about the challenge that we face in the renewable transition, and we're going to go how to resolve these challenges and how to move forward. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to focus on the economic gains because this is what our economic model will talk. But in the background, again, you should think that you almost get for free the moment you kind of deploy renewables, these two, because you increase energy security, and you, of course, they're carbon free. So I mean, they don't pollute the environment. So that's an extra thing that you get. We want to ask two main questions here, which are typical economic questions for kind of microeconomists. The first is, who are the winners and losers from this technological revolution? And think of like electricity prices will be dropping. Who is going to be affected? The other is, what will be the overall welfare gains, meaning, for example, we have income effects because of the transition to renewable and the detransition for fossil fuels. And some countries may be benefited more than others. The other question we want to ask, the other set of broad questions we want to ask is, what's the role of policies? Things like subsidy to renewables are going to become important. And already Europe and the US are leading the way. US introduced recently the Inflation Reduction Act, which is something that we will take into account in our research. And we want to see the implications of that. And also investments in the grid. Here, this will be about the transmission constraints. And again, the US has brought a big investment plan on Infrastructure Investment Jobs Acts that includes transmission. And Europe has been, I'm going to talk about Europe at the end, what's the plans of Europe and what should be doing. So this is based on two papers with Conor Walsh, the one called Clean Growth and the Economic Impacts of Clean Power. Okay. The broader research goal is to have an integrated assessment model, a model that you can think of how to assess various outcomes at the same time, and also environmental outcomes, at the same time as you have a model of energy markets, where you can consider whether how energy is deployed, from which resources, and how this is done across the world. And we want to do that to study the implications of energy transition. There are three key components of this framework. The first is that, as I said, we model energy markets, the supply and the demand of energy markets, in quite a bit of detail. So we talk about transmission, we talk about renewable deployment, we talk about fossil fuels, and so on. The second is that we care about space. So here, using insights from recent literature in quantitative spatial economics and international trade, we want to think about what will be these implications across different regions in the world. And the key thing here that you have to consider is that the renewables may be much more effective in some regions in the world where the wind blows and the sun shines versus other regions of the world. So space is something that you want to very carefully take into account here. And the final thing is that we want to think of course, what is important is you want to think of the investment in energy resources, this investment being renewables or fossil fuels, or it could be disinvestment of fossil fuels. And also the implications for resource extraction. Many countries are relying on resource extraction to have a big chunk of their budget. And so what will happen to these countries as a result of this transition to renewables? So the model is an interplay of these three big forces through integrated modeling in general equilibrium. And I will explain how this takes place. We will be talking about predictions on the renewable investment and fossil extraction in the long run, the electricity prices across countries, and welfare implication of this energy transition. So that's kind of the broad things that we will be discussing throughout the lecture. Any questions so far about that? Okay. All right, so let me start. I'm not going to give you any math today, but I'm going to try to give the model with kind of nice emoticons here. So I'm going to try to catch the eye of the generation. So I'm going to talk about energy, production, and consumption. Okay, so the first part is electricity generation. So the way to think about it, in each region, you can use some extracted fossil fuels to run power plants. These power plants will generate electricity. Or alternatively, you can deploy renewable resources that will also generate electricity. And of course, electricity, wherever it comes from, is perfect substitute. So at the end, depending on the supply, there will be some price that will be determined in the market, some price of electricity. This price of electricity will determine how much electricity will be used in production, for example. Cheaper electricity means you use more of it, and more intensive electricity sector will be benefited more from cheaper electricity than less intensive sector, like steel and so on. And then the production will determine a price in its region of the certain commodities, say steel, there will be services, it will be different sectors. And ultimately the consumer demand, therefore, depends on the price of electricity. So one way to think about it is like cheaper electricity prices will benefit ultimately the consumer because there will be more production and more efficient production. Okay? So how do we think about this model? Well, we also have to think about the macroeconomic effects, because then the consumer will save and will accumulate capital, either renewable capital or other production capital. So this will be the interplay that was mentioned before between the energy system and the consumer. So really this setup that we have is comprised of three parts. The first is what we call an energy economy model, energy system model. Depending on what's the cost of the different resources in different areas, you will use more renewables or less renewable in your energy mix. The second is a spatial economy model, where depending on the price of energy in each region, different regions will specialize in different things. Say that a certain region, renewable resources are very cheap, so energy is very cheap. Then you may want to specialize in energy-intensive sectors, and vice versa. Of course, if energy is cheap, everyone is benefited in some sense, because electricity is a factor of production for all the sectors, but some sectors will benefit more than other sectors. So this part of the model is based on this new quantitative spatial trade literature that taught us how to kind of model many, many regions across the world that are interconnected. And the interconnection here will be trade in commodities and also trade in electricity. And I will explain exactly how this is done. And the last part is the general equilibrium part, which is like macroeconomic effects of the model. What would be the average wage effects when there's growth in Europe because of energy prices dropping? And that will be taken from a standard macro model. So 3 bits really, a standard energy system model, energy economy model, a quantitative spatial literature for the regions of the economy, and a macroeconomic effects that will allow us to think of the overall interconnection of all the regions and the aggregate effects in the economy. Okay. Now, how trade happens in this model? Think of 2 regions, so it would be like London and Oxford, right? So London is producing a lot, is shipping to Oxford their goods. Oxford is producing less, is shipping its goods to London. So 2 different regions. But there's also trade, so this is gross, it goes both directions, the trade. But trade in electricity is net. It goes where you need electricity, from where you produce more electricity than you need. So think of like Manchester producing a lot of electricity by having less needs for production, while London has a lot of needs for production but produces no electricity. Then, and maybe this region, Oxford, is like kind of breaks even in terms of electricity. So then what will happen, electricity will flow through the transmission network, facing losses on the way, transmission losses, and eventually find its way to London from Manchester. That's kind of the whole concept of the model, amplified with kind of many regions and many sectors, and et cetera. Okay? Okay, so let me now explain how the economy works in terms of electricity generation and electricity markets. There's the traditional energy sector and the renewable sector. And what are the features of the traditional energy sector? Think of every traditional asset, either fossil assets or like nuclear plants and so on, as having some capacity. Some plants are really big, so they can produce potentially a lot of energy. Some plants are smaller, so can produce less energy, less electricity. How do we know what is what? Well, we have open source data from across the globe where we have geolocated the information of power plants across countries and for each location, where the size of the circle here, if you can see it, is the power capacity of the power plant in that region. So this is for each power plant across the world. Now, what is immediately obvious here for the traditional sector, like nuclear and fossil and so on, that is actually pretty much located where people live and where output is being produced. So you see northeast of the United States, central US, United Kingdom, parts of Spain, East China, right? So that's the traditional sector of electricity. And now you have the renewables. Renewables have a different technology than the traditional fossil sector. They basically run with different efficiency across different regions. So the way to think about it is that Greece is much more efficient for solar than the United Kingdom because there is more insolation. And so that will be the factor for each region in the world I, that will be the efficiency factor that it will have in, say, solar or wind. And this is like a tag. Basically, using satellite information, you can determine what's the insolation in each region in the world and use it as a coefficient of efficiency of renewables. How do we get that? Then we have data from the World Bank that has collected all this information that will tell you exactly how efficient in solar and wind is each little region of the world. And of course here, as you would expect, things depend on latitude, right? As I said, UK is less efficient in solar than Greece, but latitude is not the only thing that matters here, because there are wind patterns and other weather patterns that matter. So you have the west of the US being much more efficient than the east, even though the latitude is the same. Okay? So that's another piece of information that we use along with the global installed capacity of the plants. The second bit now, in determining the supply of electricity, is the production, but also the transmission of electricity. So the way to think about it, remember the picture I showed you before, is that each region will have a production of electricity and the demand for electricity. So if you supply more electricity than you need, then you will be a net exporter. If you supply less electricity than you need, a net importer. And the losses are not going to be randomly determined. They're going to be determined by physical constraints in the transmission network and the production. So how does this work, and how do we get data for that? It will depend on what are the connections across regions, say in the UK. Each of the connections, what's the resistance, what's the capacity of the lines, the transmission lines, and finally, how much is traded across each one of the line, which is determined by this. In more concrete terms, we have geo-coded across different regions in the United States. This is commuting zones, and regions in Europe, typically like provinces or districts and so on. We have geolocated what are the connections between the different regions and how big the capacity is, or how much energy you can transfer with the associated losses. So the matrix of losses is one thing that matters for the losses here. The second is the resistance, which is the color of its line. And the third is, of course, where energy flows. So if you send a lot of energy through high resistance lines, you will lose a lot of energy. And that will be something that our model determines endogenously as a function of the economic activity. So how do energy markets work in this model? They work in a way that typically is referred to as a merit order dispatch. And this will give you a very nice idea. So let me kind of focus on this very nice idea how renewables work in these energy markets, right? So basically, the pricing of the markets is at the marginal cost of the last producer. And that's what has created a lot of problems in the markets the last few years. But this is what it is. So assume that your renewable capacity, the renewable capital times its efficiency is up to here, and then the rest is fossil fuels. Renewables, as I told you, has basically zero marginal cost, let's say very small marginal cost. So when you need energy, they're the first to deploy because they are willing to give it with very, very low marginal cost. After renewables are being deployed, then you start with the fossil fuels that have an increasing marginal cost. As you keep on pumping gas or pumping oil, the energy cost increases, because you face decreasing in terms of scale. So what happens is that for a given prevailing price that our model determines, then you can determine who is the marginal producer here. And this means that all these guys will offer energy, electricity in the system. Okay? So what is the profits then? The renewables will make a lot of profit because they have zero marginal cost, but there will be also profits for these marginal producers here of fossil fuels. Now, what happens when more renewables are deployed in the system? Then this here moves to the right. So as a result, you have more energy produced by renewables, but also a squeezed profit margin for fossil fuels. And they're basically effectively driven out of the market. Okay? So that's how kind of renewables deploy, and that's how our model endogenously determines the prices in each one of the regions. So if one region has a lot of renewable resources, they will be able to offer lower prices because you can squeeze the margins even more out of the producers. Okay? Now I can talk about I talked to you about how the production works. Now I want to think about how will you invest to create that capacity in renewables, given this production in the markets and the trade of electricity. There are multiple differences between the two main production methods of electricity, the renewable and the fossil. So let me kind of lay them down one by one, because it's critical for our thinking of renewables. The first is that renewables are modular, meaning that every time you deploy a new renewable resource, you effectively make the same copy of itself, and then you can produce at the same efficiency as the previous unit. That's not true for fossil fuels. If you extract more, then it costs more to extract oil. If you try to burn more oil, then you face decreasing in terms of scale. So that's completely different technologies in some sense. The second is that, as I showed you before in the previous line, basically renewables are kind of facing almost zero marginal cost because whenever sun shines, you just get it, and otherwise you don't. While extracting fossil fuels, again, has an increasing marginal cost. The more you need them, the deeper you have to drill. And that's kind of very apparent in the cost, in the energy costs. The final thing, which is very critical for renewables, is that they are subject to learning by doing, which means that as you expand your renewable capacity, the cost of the next units of renewables are dropping very rapidly. So that is the reason that you saw these very rapid declines in cost that I showed you in the introduction. That's not true in general for fossil fuels. There is some technological progress, but even though we have like massive amounts of fossil fuels extraction and so on, the costs have been very close to the same over the years, even perhaps have been increasing, the cost of extraction. To solve this problem that has these three properties is a challenge. Why? Because you have to think of renewable investment in each region now and in the future, which competes with everyone that's in the same region now and in the future, and with yourself in some sense, because you have to produce this energy over time. To solve it, actually, we use some of the technical tricks that Conor Walsh came up with in his PhD thesis. So that kind of came nice along with our work because it fits nicely in the setup of renewables. And we add to this learning by doing scale effects. So the learning by doing scale effects, how do we set them? How do we set the parameters? Well, we actually look at the data where as the total installed capacity increases in the world, the total cost of installation is decreasing. So these are actual data points in the world of how when we employ more renewables, the cost of employing the next one decreases. And that's kind of what people think is learning by doing. How do we do the extraction of resources, of fossil resources? Well, we use a standard idea from Hotel in 1931 for a resource extraction problem. And these extraction problems are key for wealth effects. So what you want to do is, like, if the price of oil is very high, you want to extract a bit more today versus tomorrow. So you have like this trade-off because you will create some wealth for yourself. On the other hand, if the price of electricity drops, that will pressure downwards the price of oil, and that will mean that you're kind of will extract less as a result. And how do we have information of this extraction cost? Well, there's a recent paper in Nature that has classified all the known deposits in the world across oil, gas, and coal, and that tells you that for each one of the countries in the world that you see in different colors here, this is kind of areas in Middle East, this is the oil pits in Canada, how many billions of barrels are there, and what's the cost of extracting them. So you get a kind of a nice extraction cost curve that you can put in the model and kind of try to understand how costly it is to keep on extracting oil and how much profit you will make depending on the price of oil. Okay. All right, so this is the model in this very compact way. If you have any questions, or I can proceed in the predictions. Okay. All right, so we employ the model. We have worked a few years to kind of harmonize a number of regional data sets for 10 sectors across 2,500 regions across the world. So we have, like as I said before, commuting zones in the United States, the equivalent of districts or provinces in Europe, and so on, whatever, as granular as we can go. And that gives us information on how much each region produces in each industry, which can give us information what's the efficiency. If we see New York State producing a lot of steel, a lot of industry, then we can back out that New York State is a very efficient producer of industry. And vice versa across different regions in the world. So we use this data, and we now effectively input the learning by doing externalities in the model, and we let the model run. The model will give us predictions of what will be the growth of clean resources across the globe. Okay, so it can tell us for each region of this 2,000 region, and it can tell us for each country in the world. And the model predicts that if we let the model run from today to the next 20 years, renewables will dominate. So what we see is that countries like US and Europe will fastly decarbonize their grid, but at the same time, countries like China that have ample fossil resources will be much slower in decarbonizing. So, I mean, of course, that's a problem that's coming, because it means we need to make policy intervention like China is doing to speed up the transition. The good news is that at the same time as this global deployment is taking place, you have the prices, or the capital price and the electricity price is dropping because of the scale effect that I told you before. So in a sense, every time you can increase scale somewhere in the world, it's very good because other regions in the world will be benefited. And that's kind of what is really incredible in renewable. And we have seen in the last few years where China has been deploying renewables at an incredible rate, and everyone is benefited by the lower prices. Winners and losers now. Who is winners and losers? So what we see here, I'm going to read some of the countries, sorry if you cannot see them. So you have Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, some countries in Latin America and India. And then here you have places like Canada, Russia, and Luxembourg. And maybe Canada, Norway, Australia, Canada, Russia. Which are these countries? These countries are countries that have big fossil fuel deposits. And they actually extract them and get to increase their income. So we see that these countries, actually, some of them may lose from renewable deployment because you're subsidizing fossil fuels for renewables. So you create strong negative income effects for these countries. On the other hand, countries that are in the path of development have an opportunity now to have much lower prices, will speed up their capital accumulation and their growth. So for developing countries or countries that are in path of development, like say India, that they want to industrialize, this is an extremely large boost of the growth, and they get very big welfare gains from the transition to renewables. There's other nuances that you can read in the paper about the transmission grid and so on, and how this affects, but I will come back to that in a second. Okay, so what's the room for policy? So one important thing that we want to consider in our work is how can you intervene to make things better, to speed up the adoption of renewables. And we actually use something that happened just a couple of years ago. This is the Inflation Reduction Act. This is a policy that, among other many things, good and bad, we can discuss it later, The one very nice thing is that they gave great credit to anyone that employs renewable energy, new renewable resources, by subsidizing the electricity price, or continuing to subsidize the electricity price for many years until 2033, where it sunsets. So what you see here, this was the baseline, the previous curve that you saw, where you saw like the renewable share goes to 67%. But with the Inflation Reduction Act, over the years, this actually speeds up the transition until it sunsets. So actually, it's kind of achieving its goal, which is to speed up the renewable transition in the United States. Yes, 10 minutes. Yeah, I'll be on time. So I'm going to skip this graph too. Okay, so this is kind of some good news. I'm kind of very excited what the model says. I will discuss what how much I believe we can predict the future. But I want to talk about some challenges at the same time. Okay. So I'm going to discuss the transmission constraints, intermittency of renewables, and local opposition. Okay. And this is, I think, something we should, renewables are very important. This is the ones that will save the world from kind of temperature increase. And we have to think ahead of all these things to make things work. So transmission constraints. So what we do now, we do a couple of exercises. This is in the first paper. I'm going to show you one in the other paper. We ask the question of what will happen if you give money to invest in transmission grid. So if you improve the transmission grid. And we actually did it for the United States, where we actually have some lines, transmission lines, that they have been subsidized by a recent act of legislation, the Infrastructure and Job Act. The lines is exactly geocoded as you see here. This is the data that we have. So we incorporate these lines, we add them to the transmission network you saw before. So it's kind of increasing the capacity of the network, basically. And what we find is that the cost, of course, this is the cost estimates we get from the literature, this is about 10 billions, but it generates big increases of 1.5 billion annual benefits per year, net benefits per year. So the gains from transmission, from relaxing transmission constraints are large, and actually they are very heterogeneous. The electricity prices drop a lot near the regions where the transmission constraints are relaxed, but actually could increase in other regions. So there's a lot of interesting redistributive effects, so that people should take into account. This is the United States. What about Europe, and what about Greece? So this is from a consulting firm, IMPE, researching renewables. So this is what is the interconnection of Greece. So here you see of Europe. You see different countries in the world. How are they connected? And the thickness of a line is the capacity. And the blue is the ones that are the existing ones or under completion. The light blue is things are being planned in terms of capacity there. So there's a big line planned between Greece and Egypt with very high capacity. And where you see the green is how much renewable resources you have so that you can send green energy to other regions. And what you see is that if Europe wants to get to the Green Europe objective by 2040, not only has to invest in renewables, but it has to improve in the grid, especially in some areas in the grids in some areas in Europe that have potential for renewable energy, but they don't have yet the necessary grid infrastructure. That's the orange here is how much transmission investment they are missing. Okay, luckily here Greece is kind of have big plans of connecting Greece and Cyprus, and then hopefully with Egypt, which will create a very nice interconnected network. Also Italy with Tunisia, a very nice interconnected network of Europe, Africa, Middle East, and so on. Now, maybe I'll just skip this too. You have 5 minutes? Or, okay. Yeah, let me skip this. Okay. So, so what are the, okay, let me not skip this. Okay. So I just want to show you, sorry, this is battery, so I want to say it actually. So this is storage, right? So what can you do with batteries? What you can do with battery is basically store enough energy in the day so that you can use it through the night for solar. or with wind to use it anytime in the day, depending on when you charge the battery and discharge the battery, right? So people say that with sufficient storage, 8 hours, you can basically deploy all the energy you produced throughout the day. And we call this firm solar, this experiment firm solar, meaning solar plus 8 hours of battery. And this is the projection that us, the blue, and other engineering, papers in engineering and energy systems have for the cost of firm solar over the years. So this cost per kilowatt from 2000, we actually kind of agree with other people in the literature up to 2035, and then we're a bit more optimistic to go to 2040. But from what I showed you before, we think that there's a good reason that these prices will keep on dropping for many years to come. If that is true, and then we run these changes in the prices of firm solar in the model, we find there are big effects in welfare in the United States across regions. These are different regions in the United States, and the average effect is the blue here. The baseline is more than 2% gains on average across the United States from deploying firm solar in the next 20 years, which is kind of a pretty big amount if you consider other gains like gains from trade and so on. And if at the same time you integrate all the grid, meaning you can interconnect all the regions in the US so that you can transfer clean energy across the United States, you have even bigger gains, upwards of 2.5%. So the gains are big, and the gains are big from battery investment as well. And now that I've finished the good news, I want to talk a little bit about the opposition and the policy barriers. So renewables are actually, in many countries, deploying extremely fast. Maybe you don't see it because if you live in London, but you will see it if you're near a kind of windy area or big fields where you deploy solar and so on. And you know, for some of them, for some people, they are an eyesore, and actually they require a big, large land clearance to be deployed. That doesn't mean that you have to clear the land, but this means that you have some certain requirements. You cannot build a new building next to a wind turbine because then you won't be able to collect wind. In Greece already, much more than actually, it's already above 1% of Greece is actually covered by renewable, has the clearance of land for renewables. That's quite a big amount, right? And if we are to reach our energy targets without offshore wind, then we need to have multiples of that. I expect that it's not long from now that until resistance to renewables develops. And the question is what you do, because this is really the only way that we can, in the near future, decarbonize. You have even worse cases where in the United States, local governments or states are actually increasingly put more barriers to renewables because they want to protect fossil fuels, which makes it even more dramatic and sad. How can you avoid these problems? One thing is that centralization here is key. Having a central planning authority like Europe, where it kind of has a vision of how to deploy renewables, how to deploy transmission resources and so on, is going to be very important. But at the same time, we have to think about that it has to be knit with care, or else opposition will mount. So the way that I think, what I mean care, is that when you deploy renewables, you have to think of the local effects, and you have to take this green box I told you, the profits, and part of them distributed to local people that will be now benefited by the deployment of the renewable, not just the eyesore, but there will be some immediate benefit to them. Of course, the lower price, lower energy price, something also that may happen at the same time. And then, as I said before, data indicates opposition comes from a variety of reasons, but the most important thing is when you see it in your backyard, right? So then we need to figure out how to compensate to these people that they have it next to their, in a way that will make them happy and will make everyone happy. Okay, so let me just give some conclusions and some food for thought to discuss. I think the age of renewables have begun. It's a very exciting time. It's a really big technological revolution. They spur adoption because of the lower capital costs, which further lowers capital costs for everybody doing and lowers electricity prices. And it's really an exciting time. Are we the optimists in this research? I showed you that we kind of project bigger cost declines than others. Well, I want to say that many predictions, this is the Bloomberg New Energy, I forgot the last term. It's like predictions for renewables. And what you see here in the black, this is every year, what is the actual deployment of renewables? And the yellow is the prediction of where it will go the next year, right? every year. They were consistently under-predicting what will happen, even last year. And we hope we are much closer to the black line. We are actually much closer to the black line than the yellow line. So, and that's hopeful because it means it's exceeded our expectations. And the last thing that I want to do is I want to kind of spur a little bit more excitement because not only the world is increasing, this is the share of production coming from renewables, not only the world is increasing its renewable share of production in electricity, but also we see very soon European Union will hit its targets for like 42.5% renewables by 2030, but also actually one of the champions of renewables is Greece, which is something to be proud about. Not so many things, but I said the last 20 years were two things we are proud about. This and that Greece won the Euro 2004.
Thank you, Costa, and thank you for inventing a positive note to finish with.
And the Hellenic Observatory.
Go Greece. I don't want to start a long conversation with Costas about this, so I will invite your questions while you collect your thoughts. So, however, I will ask one question only, and it becomes my standard question when it's a presentation by an economist in this room. You say that the marginal cost of production of renewables is much lower than for traditional, kind of brown energy. And then also you say there's, I mean, you didn't say economies of scale, but, there's learning by doing. So there's, cumulative benefits. But then you saw that the IRA subsidies had, an effect on energy, the shift to renewables. I don't think you said something about the total welfare effect of that. But then, if we are very strictly economists and we say, well, if there's all these positive externalities of renewable energy, then there's no market failure that government intervention should come in and correct. So should then the policymaker in Europe and in the US say that I should spend my money on, I don't know, education, childcare, and whatever, because renewables has it all? Is the message too optimistic and doesn't see the fact that there must be some sort of market failure here?
Yeah, so the market failure is the learning by doing, in the sense that you create externalities of learning to the others. So in a sense, you want to coordinate in subsidies to kind of increase we are kind of underinvesting than the amount that we should. Yeah. So yeah, we haven't. This is a very interesting question. We haven't actually put the model into work to see exactly what are the optimal subsidies that you can do across countries. Because some countries, for example, if US subsidize renewables, will create much bigger externalities than if Greece does it, because the market is much more in Greece. So you want to create big market effects.
Okay, raise of hands. I'll take triplets of questions, if I may. We'll start one question here in the middle, and one further back, over there, afterwards. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Oh, I'll take the ads of two questions at a time.
Theodoros Avantopoulos, Cardiff University and Hellenic Observatory. So I have short questions, mainly in the model. So in terms of innovation, do you have it in the model? Because what I see is that you have constant technology. The investment happens mainly to increase capacity, right, in terms of generation. You don't really actually advance technology, either in terms of production or in terms of transmission, right? The second question is in relation to transmission systems. So what I expect is that you don't account for market structure in the transmission system, right? Because there was last year, Lucas Davis, he gave a presentation here at LSE, had a paper about problems in the US infrastructure in terms of connecting regional markets in the transmission of electricity. It's very isolated. They have one interconnector, and it's very difficult to actually create market competition. So that creates a problem for investment in renewables. So how do you respond to that in relation to the model? So a very technical question. I mean, I know we didn't see the maths, and they're very difficult to answer, but I just want to hear your opinion on this. And the practical one, the practical one.
And when are you going to write the book of questions?
It's in terms of back of the envelope calculation. So if we want to make all this investment in terms of capacity increases in the transmission system, do we have the capacity in terms of budget constraints on the governmental level? Do you think it's feasible because of all the things we see with problem deficits and, not...
Okay, I'll let you answer
sorry
these questions before we move on. When I said triplets of questions, I didn't mean per person. But
well, the last one, the capacity, the subsidy that we do for the IRA is just flat tax to consumers, and then you just redistribute to the firms. So we do a very simple experiment. The other ones are more difficult. Like, so what's the way we deal with the transmission here is like it's exogenous. This is what the data gives us. And then we add a few lines that were planned to finish, they're about to finish. So then we just add them to the network. We haven't thought of like how do you endogenously work out the optimal investment you do in the system. But that's actually like a third paper we want to write, which we actually have very nice European data of what is being planned, what's under commission, what's under construction, and we want to compare it with some social optimum. But it's a very hard problem to explain why, but I hope we can address it at some point. And the other one, well, let me not answer all the questions now. Yeah, maybe I'll answer the innovation question afterwards.
okay, very good. There was a question over there. We'll take. Indicate your. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the lady with the glasses over there.
Thank you. My name is Taehyun Kim. I'm a postgraduate student in environmental policy and regulation here at LSE. I have two different questions regarding electricity market. So first one would be about the merit order that you briefly explained. I remember reading some experts saying that the era of merit order has now ended with more renewables in our electricity market, because the merit order system is basically a pricing mechanism that was established back in the days with mostly fossil fuels, expensive power sources in our electricity market. Do you think we could move on to a new type of pricing mechanism in our electricity market? If so, what would be our alternative? And the other question will be about electricity market structure. I think it is one of the things that you did not mention on your slides. So basically, most of the electricity markets in the US and in the EU are mostly liberalized and open electricity market, which is pretty much different from the situation in Asia. For example, in South Korea, which is my home country, they are 100% regulated and operating by state-owned utility. So do you think there are certain type of electricity market structure that are more conducive to expanding renewables? If so, what kind of structure would be better than the other? If not, why? Thank you.
Yeah, so I will mix a little bit the answers because I cannot precisely answer. They are deep questions, so I cannot give you a perfect answer. But the reason that the merit order dispatch still remains one of the most predominant wholesale market structures is that actually now favors renewable a lot, right? Because there are very low marginal costs for the marginal guys are kind of affecting the price a lot. And I do not know what's the optimal way to design it, but that's kind of a very interesting problem because eventually now the renewables will take over. But there will be some marginal provider, I guess, at the end, like storage provider, firm solar, and so on. So I'm not quite sure how to. Yeah, I'm not sure I answer all the questions, but yeah.
Can I chip in with a question here, because I noticed something about India that I wanted to ask, and of course it's not really equivalent, but the equivalent in Europe to India would be Poland, who refused to move to renewables because they have a lot of coal and a lot of the economy relies on. So decarbonization for Poland is much more costly, let's say, than for even for Germany. But of course, India cannot connect to a grid very easily, and also it doesn't have really the capacity to produce solar panels. So everything will have to be imported, and of course, there's not enough supply for it. So you will have to compete with other countries, and they cannot really afford to play the high quality, high price game. So in a way, in a kind of more social policy kind of perspective, it would make sense for India to exploit brown resources for energy because they have them there. Yes, you're right, in the global market, maybe the marginal cost of renewable energy is cheaper, but if you are competing with Germany, who imports the Chinese panels, probably India would be better off, and in that sense also Poland, staying a bit brown for a bit longer. But then, based on your model, and what comes out of it is that then they will have really lost the train in terms of where they are in the green transition.
Oh, well, they can still always kind of import panels.
Well, if they're connected to the grid, they can import
They
panels.
can always
yeah.
import regionally panels. That's a nice thing about renewable. If you can use them, you can just regionally install them there and use the energy locally.
Provided that you produce the panels.
No, you can import them from China. That's the model allows you to import from China
Yeah.
at the global price.
Okay, so my point was that I don't think India can afford to import from China.
Well, but eventually will because the price keeps dropping. So yeah, you're right. In the transition, maybe the brown coal. Yeah, but eventually, I think it'll be cheap for everyone. I wanted to say one. Now that came out, it's actually in our model is efficient to have local market locational marginal pricing. So for once, if you believe the model, that's actually the optimal way to do it. And of course, you can always redistribute the profits, right? You can tax the profits and redistribute it. But the question is whether the pricing mechanism is optimal.
Okay, now we will take two questions, one by the lady there and one by the gentleman. And
Thank you for the presentation. I'm a working professional in renewable energy in the UK, and some of the challenges you mentioned are very relevant to the project that we're facing here today. So one of my question is, with the geopolitical risk on the rise, for example, in Europe, we have critical raw material act coming in and also CBAM, carbon border adjustment mechanism. How do you think the future market will look like, for example, for generation companies and for a lot of the manufacturers? Thank you.
How do I think what?
How the future market will look like for deployment of renewable? Will it still be at the same place, and will the stress be passed to a lot of the manufacturers and generations?
Okay, yeah. So,
okay, go on.
another one? Yeah. No.
If you want to answer this.
Yeah, I think the critical materials are really for the storage. This is where the critical materials are really, really important. But the good thing about the storage technology is that they keep on evolving and kind of becoming better and using different materials. So it's kind of hard to predict where we'll be 10, 15 years from now. But Europe anyways is kind of doing some initiatives to secure critical materials. So that's kind of I think it's a big deal, and they're doing the right thing. But I cannot predict what's happened 15 years from now.
A question here by the gentleman in the front.
Oh,
Werner Casey, once of this house and other places. Just before I say anything else, I want to say thank you to Vassilis and Kevin for making this whole thing happen. And this centre and observatory has been a great success over many years, and as a beneficiary of it, I just want to emphasise it. I'm going to ask one question only, not three, but I'm going to ask it a bit about something which you only touched upon at the very beginning and said I'm not really going to talk about very much, and that was that you said, well, this of course will ensure energy security relative to alternatives. I was reading the other day about how there are 6,500 Chinese chips on modern American aircraft carriers, 6,500 Chinese chips on a modern US aircraft carrier. Now, that is a question of security, and it seems to be quite an important one. But a lot of the technology which you are talking about is also heavily dependent upon not only technologies, in other words, where things are being produced that feed into this, but also commodities or products, including rare earths, which feed into this, and how terribly dependent one might be upon that. So it is the same security issues as one might have had with oil in the last half century. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. And as I said before, the photovoltaics and the wind turbines, they're not very material intensive. The storage is. But I think the new ways of storage now, of big storage, like, are using different materials than the critical materials. So I hope that we will transit to a case where, you know, like in a few years, we won't be worried about critical materials so much in storage as we are now. But also the energy security not only comes from storage, but also from transmission, right? And that's copper. That's not as intensive, of course, as like, I don't know, I forgot all the materials that go to lithium and so on. So yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a conundrum, but there are many opportunities versus just depending on oil from Russia or liquid nitrogen from US, which is like 3 times more expensive. So you're between, like, you know, like 2 very bad options. And I think the renewables are much better from my perspective.
Okay, a question here in the front.
So I want to touch on something that I'm not sure how much of that is in the model, which is about the production of these photovoltaics or of the turbines. So so obviously there are some kind of competition about where these things should be produced, and I guess an issue is kind of, I guess given that there's learning by doing that you emphasized quite a lot. I don't know, what should be policies of, I don't know, like the EU or of, I don't know, in the US or other countries about how, I don't know, how much protectionism there should be about that, or in particular areas of that, and what kind of policies do you think should be on that front?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, and we have been thinking about it. I think the correct, and I mean, we may have different views, but I think you probably will agree, the correct way to think of learning by doing externalities is not like global completely, but it would be like regional. So all China, all US, and all Europe. And in this sense, you can see why they have this protection review in the Inflation Reduction Act, where they subsidize locally, because they hope to exploit very local learning by doing externalities. And if that view of the world is correct, and I cannot tell you the coefficient, you know, the slope for Europe, the slope for China, but if that view is correct, then we need to subsidize our local industries for renewables, like to produce panels, to produce wind, as Europe is actually doing the last few years. Kind of they have identified this kind of local global externalities, and they want to subsidize industry exactly to bring them back to Europe and generate learning by doing effects. Yeah. Having said that, let me just say that these technologies that already, these are of course the manufacturing process, but the technologies that are based, the patents are global, right? So now, and these are diffusing very, very fast. Of how then of course how do you implement in production is a little bit more kind of learning by doing. The technology, but now you have new technologies like perovskite and so on, different materials that we can use. And these are diffusing very fast, but the question is how to put in the manufacturing process, which is a little bit more difficult and has more localized learning by doing, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. A question there in the third row by the smiling.
I'm going to pretend to ask a question. My name's Simon Glendinning. I'm the head of the European Institute, which have been home to the Hellenic Observatory for many years. We're losing a part of ourselves, but we wish you well. And that is really what I wanted to say. So now I'll pretend to ask a question, which is whether there's a story to be told about rent on land in Greece as a result of change of land use. Classical economists would think that rent is determined by differential productivity of land, and good land is scarce, and the marginal land would get no rent. But those marginal lands now might be really, really great at producing photovoltaic electricity, and indeed the whole of Greece basically could be covered with such things, and you'd think that there'd be a kind of equalization of productivity of land as a result of that, which a classical economist might tell you that rent would tend to zero. Is that the future of rent in Greece?
I just want to say, actually, for this lecture, I did a lot of work looking at maps in Greece. Then in the end, it just gave that number of 1%. But like with the geospatial data for the polygons of like where the renewables are, and what you can see is that almost all the renewables are in like very remote areas. I was not able to kind of identify them, but it's very remote areas, so places where people wouldn't live so far. But now we're already hitting the 2%. And then, so the rents, I don't think the rents are affected by renewables, mostly like Airbnb or some other policy failures. But yeah, in the future, if we don't go to offshore, this is going to start affecting land use and so on. And this is going to be very problematic for Greece. We need to make decisions very soon on that. The anecdote is already my mom is protesting again renewables in Greece, and it's kind of tough situations in the family. So
we'll explore a bit the Greece thing, but can I just say that I never expected to hear the philosopher, the professor of philosophy at the European Institute to ask a bitter function question. So I'm very, very impressed, Simon. I have a long waiting question here, but can we take two now? The gentleman with the laptop, and then 2 rows ahead of him.
Tobias Schuster from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. I would disagree that there are no market failures that we need to correct. Fossil fuels have huge externalities, especially for our health.
Can you go close to the mic? I cannot hear you very well.
Fossil fuels have huge externalities for our health. If I understood you correctly, you have only spoken of the explicit cost reductions of the energy transition, but not the implicit cost reductions, including externalities, especially in terms of health co-benefits. Or in other words, are you including health co-benefits such as a reduction in air pollution, mortality, and avoiding negative health impacts of climate change into the welfare gains or not?
Very good. Before you answer, a question by...
Yes, thank you. I have a question about optimal policy, and in particular the sequencing of policy. So for a given budget to be provided by the government to encourage the energy transition, you can build a grid, or you can subsidize the production of solar, the implementation of solar panels. I was wondering, is it better perhaps to build a grid, because then that might make putting solar panels more profitable, because then you can access a bigger market, meaning that there are advantages to subsidizing particular aspects like grid before you subsidize the production of solar panels?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. This is we want to write a follow-up paper, as I said, in transmission, and this is things that we need to consider. We haven't thought of this carefully, but it would be very interesting. Like, do you want to subsidize production, or you want to subsidize improvement of the grid, or even more, do you want to subsidize new connections that were not even before there? That could be even more important, which is like you saw the Cyprus and mainland Greece connection, and others like mainland Greece to Egypt. Yeah. So I don't have a good answer, but it's a good question that we'll be thinking about. The other question, yeah, so we did not take into account environmental externalities for the simple reason that we want to give you the worst case scenario. Like, under these circumstances, even though all these things happen, it's so much better with renewables than it would be. So on top of what I showed you, can add all the environmental gains. I told you it's like almost a free lunch. You do that, you get cheaper energy, and on top you save the environment. I mean, it's just great. But I agree. In one point we will add those, but we want to advance the agenda more before we go to the externalities. Environmental externalities, minded, are notoriously difficult to measure. So whatever you put there in these numbers, someone else will say it's 10 times bigger or 10 times smaller. So.
Okay. A question by the gentleman in the front, and then the...
A slight follow-on from the rental question. Greece is heavily dependent on tourism. Is there a tension whereby too many renewables will actually make an economic loss in the tourist industry?
Especially wind turbines.
I mean, you're all welcome, but I don't think we should be based only on tourism. So I don't think the renewables are going to affect. Already they are in very remote areas so far. From what I checked, places where it's hard to access, it's not near the seaside and stuff like that. Again, if you start putting them on the seaside, which will eventually happen if we don't go offshore, then it will create a problem. But right now, the problem is not renewables for tourism in Greece. And tourism shouldn't be the main industry of Greece. If anything, renewables might be the main industry. You know, energy security could be something we should rely on. We have problems with energy security for decades in Greece, and there's a hope to resolve it.
Okay, I was planning to ask a question if we had run out of questions, there is one more, but let me ask it now. I mean, as you think about, the incentive structure of the producer for renewables versus traditional energy, you can think also about the incentive structure of the policymaker, because obviously the transition to renewables, I'm talking about Greece now, the transition to renewables, we know it makes sense environmentally in the long term and the short term. We know it makes, as you were just saying, it's a better specialization for the country in the longer term. But the short-term political cycle says that, I need to have jobs to say that my current account is good. There's so revenues from arrivals, tourist arrivals, and so forth. So is there something into that you think, kind of policy can help, maybe some that, I don't know, like the US does better, that the EU doesn't do because it's a bit more fragmented? Or is there some sort of framework within the country that can overcome this kind of policy, the timing consistency, basically, problem?
Yeah, I think there are so many gains now from deploying renewables right now because the prices are low and also the price of energy is high. That I think facilitating their deployment is the most critical thing. And Greece has this RAE, I think it's called the Independent Authority of kind of dealing with renewable deployment, that is doing this very fast. So that's good news. You can see the contrary. Like I think this in the US now, the time that it takes to connect to the grid it went from 2 to 5 years recently. So it has been, transmission constraints have been binding very much there. So I think kind of resolving the transmission connection issue is the most important thing, given how much gains could be realized because of the high energy prices.
Good. Okay, we'll close with one last question from over there.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm a student studying economics at LSE. And my question is about the future of fossil fuel companies in the renewable transition. Do you see them having a full-scale net zero being achieved by carbon capture or sequestration? Or do you see their role gradually diminish in the future as renewables present itself as a cheaper alternative? Thank you.
There are two general types of carbon capture. We talked about it. There's a carbon capture when you emit and you capture in the source, and that's kind of easy. But there's another carbon capture we were discussing yesterday, which is trying to get it out of the atmosphere, which is very, very, very difficult and very, very expensive. I don't think this is coming anytime soon, like maybe 10, 20, 30 years. So I think where the best bang for our money is, including the fossil fuels companies, is just to employ renewables now. And they are actually very experienced in doing scale projects like offshore and so on. So many of them are actually doing that, and that's great news. But I don't think right now we should invest anything we can just to learn, right? Like including carbon capture. I don't think carbon capture is going to make a dent in the carbon emissions the next 20 years. That's except the direct source carbon capture, of course, which is filters. Yeah.
Okay, we need to stop here, but we can continue part of this discussion outside. Exposed, thank you very much to our speaker, Professor Arkolakis, all of you for joining us. Please join us outside for a sip of wine.
Thanks a lot.